Yay, it's art time, and I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to the channel. Today we have a video that's all about watercolor. This video is going to be for absolute complete beginners. So if you've never picked up a brush before, or if you've always been curious to learn about watercolor and didn't know where to start, I got you, fam. I'm glad that you're here, so welcome. Before we get started into painting, let's talk about what supplies you'll need. So to start, obviously, it's in the name, you're going to need some water. You can use just any old cup that you'd like. This was an old, like a jam or jelly preserves. This was an old preserves jar that I've cleaned out and that I'm going to use to paint with. You'll also need some paper towels. So any brand will do, but it's good to have that on your workspace. You'll also need some watercolor paper. So let's talk about that. Since you're a beginner, I would not go out and buy anything super expensive or super fancy. So just like any art supply, there's a whole range. Because you're just starting out, I would just pick something that's really simple and it'll help you as you grow. So I've got some Canson brand here. It works great. I just picked this up at Michael's. I cut it smaller to size here so it'd be more manageable for me to use for this demonstration. And the only thing you might want to pay attention to is your weight. So this is 140 pounds, and basically all that means is you just want something that's heavier than like a normal copy paper, right? Because if you're using just like a normal kind of everyday printer paper, it's not really going to absorb the water very well. And what you'll find is as you're trying to paint, you're going to get these weird ripples and ridges throughout your work. So you want something that's got a nice thickness to it. And so you can tell if you just kind of take it and shake it, you can hear the noise that it makes and you can hear how thick it is. So let's give it a try and see if my mic will pick this up. Do you hear that? Awesome. So that's what you're looking for. You just need a nice thick paper. You don't need anything super duper fancy. Just regular old Canson brand will work just fine for you. Okay. You'll also need some brushes. And so I understand if you're a complete beginner, there's a lot of options out there, and I can understand that being super overwhelming. But there's all different kinds. You've got big ones and small ones and thick ones and thin ones. For the purposes, again, if you're just starting out, you don't need any super expensive or fancy brushes. Anything that you find will work just fine. I actually today am going to be using this brand that I found. They're actually made for like kids. They've got plastic handles, but they work great. So this is what I'm going to be using today. You just kind of want something that's not too small. You want like a nice medium size brush. Something with a rounded tip like what I have here will work just fine. You can also, if you can't find a round brush, you can also use something like this, like a flat brush. Something that's like more square will work fine. It'll cover lots of area. What you don't want to use for this kind of demonstration is like an itty bitty detail brush, because we're going to need it to hold a little more water and cover some more ground. Okay, so once you've got your brushes, we're going to move on to the star of the show, which is our watercolor. Whoop. So watercolor comes in all different forms. What I have here is like kind of like a pan or a cake. You've got all your colors here. They come kind of dry. They also, again, come in tubes, so it's up to you what kind you want. For beginners, I'll give you a close-up of this. I really like this brand Prang. I've used this a lot, especially when I was a full-time art teacher. This works great for beginners. You have a lot of colors. It's like a high enough quality where it's going to look nice, but it's not too terribly expensive. It should be nice and accessible. You can also use something like Crayola. Really just any kind of watercolor you find should be okay, especially if you're just a beginner. So that's what I love about watercolor, is the fact that it is widespread, it's accessible. You can get it for not too terribly expensive if you want to get started. So that should work for you just fine. So now that we've got our supplies ready to go, let's talk about how to paint. So let's start again with our watercolor here. So this might sound silly, but when I was, again, a teacher and I used these palettes in the classroom, what I found is a lot of people didn't know how to open them properly. And then what happened is your top is not going to be able to go back on, and that's super not fun. So if you choose to do a palette like this, I want you to think of it kind of like a door, right? And so this side, these little knobby edges are kind of like the hinges of your door. So this is going to be the back part of your palette, which makes this the front. So you're going to see like kind of like a little ledge here. Think of this as like your handle where you would open your door. So again, this is the back. We do not open from here. This is the front, so this is where you open it. So you can just go ahead and pop it open. Ta-da! And now we're ready to go. So now that we're ready to paint, let's set up your workspace. If you've got, like, I've got extra paper here, I'm gonna hide this. You could clear this off completely if you just wanna paint on the table. Since I'm just doing a super quick demo for you, I'm just gonna paint on top of this. It'll work just fine. So let's dive in. Okay, so now that we have our supplies, let's talk about painting. So in here we have our palette with all of our beautiful colors. And when you open up your palette, you'll see when you feel these are dry. So this is activated by water, which is why we call it watercolor, right? So again, the dry part in here is our color. We call that pigment. Pigment's a really important word. If we were in a classroom, I'd make you repeat it after me. We'll put it up on the screen for you so you can see how it's spelled. But pigment, again, is what gives paint its color. So it's awesome because without pigment, we wouldn't have all these beautiful colors to work with. But when you mix pigment with binder, the problem is if you put this stuff on too thick, it's gonna dry really, really sticky, and it basically becomes like a glue. When I was in the classroom, I did have students who, maybe weren't following directions all the way. And they would put on so much pigment on their paintings and turn it in. It never really dried and kind of turned to that gluey substance. And when they would turn their paintings in, they literally got glued together to the person whose painting was on top of theirs. We don't want that to happen to you. So you've probably worked with some paints in the past where you need to put it on thick. This is not one of them. So you always want to make sure that you're adding like a little bit of water. And I'll teach you how to fix it just in case you add too much pigment. Okay? So never, ever, 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 never scoop this stuff out and paint with it super thick, or you're just going to give yourself more problems and your painting is going to be sticky and lumpy. And we don't want that. So when we get started, again, we have our paint ready to go. We're going to grab our brush. Again, I'm just using like a medium, kind of a round brush here. We always want to start with our brush in the water. So I've got my brush in here. And this is going to sound kind of nitpicky, but I want you to get in good habits, especially since you're new to watercolor. And when you're going to rinse your brush in water, which you're going to do a lot, you don't ever want to take this wet, drippy brush and slam it on the edge here. Okay, when you need to get that extra water off, we're just going to gently wipe on the side. So why do we want to do that? Well, one day you're going to have a brush filled with pigment, and if you hit it on the side, that's going to splash all over your painting. And if you're working with friends, it's probably going to splash on your friend's painting, and they might not want to be your friend anymore if you're splashing paint all over their painting. So get yourself in good habits now, so that way as you progress and get more advanced in your watercolor, you're doing things that are going to help you. So when you get your brush wet, you're going to swirl, and again, we're going to wipe on the side. Beautiful. So, okay, so to paint, we're going to start with a wet brush. Did I say wet brush or dry brush? Wet brush. So we're going to start with a wet brush. We're going to wipe this off the side, and then we're going to dig into our pigment. So again, we're never going to scoop it out. Think of it as you're just going to gently wipe the top of it off, right? So you don't want to use too much, and I'll teach you what to do if you need more. So in general, just a general rule of thumb, if you're working with like a pan or a cake watercolor like I am here, you want to swirl it in there 3 times to start. If you want more pigment, you can go up to maybe 5. In general, again, I wouldn't go a lot more than maybe 8 because you might get too much pigment. And if you need more, you can always add more. So again, let's go ahead and roll. We're starting with a wet brush or dry brush. Wet brush, we're going to wipe off the side. I'm going to swirl my pigment 3 times. Ready? 1, 2, 3. And then we can paint. Yay! So now that we've got some paint on our paper here, I want you to start to think about watercolor as maybe not so much of a paint, but closer to a dye. So what's happening now is this paper is going to absorb our water. It's going to absorb the pigment, and our pigment is just kind of floating around in the water here. So if we want a darker color, we can add more pigment. If you want a lighter color, you can add water. So check this out. If I just take a wet brush, again, wipe a little bit off on the side, and you add water, you just water down your pigment and your color's lighter. Isn't that cool? So if we want to go darker, we're just going to add more pigment. So again, you always start with a nice rinsed brush. We're going to swirl, let's just say 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we're going to paint. And now it's darker. Pretty cool, right? So that's how you can kind of control the light or dark of your color. I always recommend starting light because it's easier to add more pigment than it is to keep watering it down, especially if you're working with multiple colors. So let's see what it looks like if we just, let's say we weren't paying attention or we were just like doing way too much and we just way overload this with pigment. Okay, so I could actually, let's get a closer up here. You could actually probably add a little more pigment to this just because my brush holds a lot of water, so it doesn't pick up as much pigment because it's watering it down as I put it in there. If you have a drier brush, sometimes it's easier to get more pigment. So hopefully you can see this on the camera. So where you've done it right, you should always be able to see just like a little bit of paper through the water. If you like are getting it and it's like super opaque, or if it looks lumpy, that means you have too much pigment. So it's easier to fix it now than to wait for it to kind of like dry to fix it. So again, if you put on too much pigment, you're just gonna take a wet brush, wipe on the side, add some water, and check it out. Easy peasy, right? So that's how we just do general painting. Let's say that there's a color that you want that isn't in your set. What do? We're gonna have to mix colors. But let's think about this. If I, let's say, want like a yellow green, am I gonna put green in my yellow? Probably not a good idea. Because what you're gonna find that happens is next time you wanna use yellow, it's gonna be all polluted and it's gonna be yucky, and we don't want that, right? So again, what I like using a pan set for is because you have a palette here to mix on. So when you're mixing colors, you always want to start with the lighter color because it is so much easier to make a light color dark than to turn a dark color light. It takes a lot less paint that way. So let's just say I want to mix a color. I'm gonna, again, swirl my brush in the water, wipe off on the edge here, and let's just say I want to start with yellow. How many times am I going to swirl it? Let's start with 3. 1, 2, 3. Now you might find with a lighter pigment like yellow, you're going to need more swirls than that because it's going to be too light. So you'll kind of feel your way through the more you experiment. Your darker colors, you might need less swirls, and your lighter colors, you might need more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There we go, a little bit more. Beautiful. So if you notice, I've got my yellow here again on my palette, and I am going to rinse this brush before I put it in the next color. Beautiful and fresh. So I've got a nice clean brush again, wiping on the side. And let's just say I want to use this kind of like red orangey color here to make this a little bit, we're going to change color. So when you move to your dark color, you always want to start with a little bit, right? Because it's easier to add more than it is to take it out. So I'm just going to take the tippy tip of my brush and just go in little tiny swirls, maybe about 3 times. Let's see if y'all can see that. I just have a teeny tiny bit of orange on there. So I'm not loading up my brush. I can always add more if I need it. Okay, we're gonna swirl in here and check it out. That little bit was enough to change it. So let's say I want more of this color. Before that brush goes back in there, you gotta clean it out. You wanna keep these colors nice and fresh and pure. So we're going to wipe on the edge. Again, you might just need like a little tippy tap there. And now it's a little bit darker. Check that out. And again, if you need more, just load up your pigment. And if you still find it's too light, we can start all over. So we're going to, maybe you, again, wipe a little more water off your brush, load a little more pigment on there. There we go. I'm going to rinse, wipe, get some more pigment, mix. And because I have less water in here, it's going to come out a little bit darker. Pretty cool, right? So once you've mixed your colors, let's say you've used all this area and you're like, oh man, I ran out of room. This is also super duper easy to clean. So you can just take your handy dandy paper towel I like to rip off a piece just to make it more manageable. If this is still wet, you can just literally wipe it out. If you have some dried on color in there, you can just take your paper towel, dip it in your water, squeeze out the extra, and just kind of give it a good wipe down. And now you've got a fresh surface that you can paint on again. Pretty cool, right? Now you know the very basics of watercolor. From here, once you try out some painting on your little paper here, we can move on to some techniques. Coming up, I'm going to have videos for you with different watercolor techniques. So we're going to have a basic video along with some more advanced techniques and learning how to do some textures with watercolor. So stay tuned, subscribe to the channel, and come along for the ride if you'd like to make some more art. Until next time, keep creating!